The big gate opened slowly, and the human boy walked inside with his small bag hanging from his shoulder and his eyes looking at the shining buildings around him, and his steps were slow and careful, and his heart was beating fast, and his name was Eli, and he was the first human ever to be allowed in this alien academy that floated above a strange purple planet in a distant galaxy far from Earth. And as he walked past the security beam, the scanner blinked green, and the tall robot guard gave a small nod. He entered the main hallway and saw colors and lights he had never seen before, and walls that moved, and stairs that floated, and strange plants growing upside down, and a group of alien girls walked past him, whispering in a language he could not understand, and one of them stared at him with glowing eyes and raised one eyebrow in curiosity, while the others laughed behind their wings and tails, and his face turned red. But he kept walking. He reached the classroom door, which opened with a soft chime, and all the students inside stopped talking and turned their heads to look at him, and they were all girls from different species, and some had 4 arms, and others had smooth blue skin or long pointed ears or eyes like mirrors. And they stared at him as if he was a lost animal, and some looked curious, and some looked confused, and a few looked afraid. La teacher stood at the front of the room, and she was tall and thin and floated slightly above the ground, and her eyes were like glowing orbs, and her voice echoed without her mouth moving, and she said in a calm tone that this is your new classmate, and his name is Eli, and he will be studying with you from today onward. And then she looked at Eli and told him to sit anywhere he liked, looked around and saw many seats empty, but every time he moved towards one, the girls sitting nearby shifted uncomfortably or whispered something to each other, and finally he sat at the far corner near a window where no one was nearby, and he placed his bag on the table and tried to hide his nervousness, but his hands were shaking slightly, and he looked out the window and saw a flying whale swimming through the sky, and he blinked in disbelief. The lesson began, and strange symbols appeared in the air, and the teacher spoke in the galactic language, but a small translator chip in Eli's ear converted the words into simple English, and the topic was galactic history and timelines of ancient wars and treaties. And Eli listened quietly, trying to understand, but he felt eyes watching him, and when he looked up, he saw 3 girls still staring at him without blinking, and one of them quickly looked away when their eyes met. During the lunch break, Eli stayed at his table and opened the food capsule his father had packed for him, and it had Earth snacks like apple slices and a small peanut butter sandwich, and he noticed all the alien girls were eating strange glowing cubes and sipping from floating jelly orbs. And then one girl walked up to him, and she had soft silver hair, and her eyes sparkled like stars, and she said hello in perfect English and asked if he was really from Earth. He nodded and said yes, and she smiled and said her name was Nyxia, and she told him not to mind the others because they had never seen a humtha. Morning light came in through the crystal walls of the academy, and Eli walked slowly into the classroom with his head held high, and his eyes scanning the room, and his steps were quieter than yesterday, but his heart still felt heavy. And he could still smell that strange green smoke in his mind, and remember the way everyone laughed, except Nyxia, who stood by him with a calm smile and soft voice. He sat at the same table near the window and placed his bag gently on the surface and tried to focus on the strange shapes floating in the air as the teacher explained the science of gravity, flow across planets with different masses and elements. And although the words were new and the examples confusing, Eli tried his best to understand, and his translator helped a little, but not enough to make it feel easy. As he listened, he noticed whispers around him like small insects crawling through the room, and whenever he turned to look, the alien girls looked away quickly, and one of them had bright orange hair with tips that looked like flames, and she pointed at him while hiding her face behind her hand, and another girl with silver scales on her cheek chuckled without moving her lips, and they all acted like he could not see or hear them, but he did ne'er turn from her seat, and whispered softly to him that they were just scared, and they did not know what he could do, and that was why they acted. Strange and Eli asked her if she also thought he was dangerous, and Nyra shook her head slowly and said no. I think you are different, but not bad. And then she looked down and said, but some of them think. You will bring change, and change is always scary for those who love comfort. Later, during the skills class, they were told to partner up and practice using mind control crystals to move small rocks across the air, and every girl quickly paired with someone, except Eli, who stood alone holding a pale blue crystal that felt cold in his palm, and the teacher watched him from the side and said, try to focus on your center and connect your thought to the shape of the crystal and let it feel your will. Eli closed his eyes and tried hard to follow the instructions, and he imagined the rock floating and moving forward like the teacher showed, but nothing happened, and he opened his eyes and saw the rock still on the table without a sign of movement, and he sighed and looked around and saw the others already making the rocks spin or float in circles, and he felt a sting in his chest like he was broken or wrong. Nyxia came over and offered to help, and held his hand gently with hers, and told him to breathe slower and stop thinking about proving anything and just feel the weight of the rock and its place in the space around it. And then she guided his hand, and the crystal in his palm started to glow with soft light, and the rock lifted slowly into the air, and Eli gasped without speaking, and Nyxia smiled with pride. But then a loud laugh broke the moment, and a voice said, maybe he is using her powers and not his own. And the girl with flaming orange hair stepped forward and said, humans are weak and fake, and they do not belong here. And she looked at Eli and said, your kind burns planets and makes war, and now you want to learn in our school and pretend you are kindly. Looked down and said nothing, and Nyxia turned to the girl and said, you do not know him, and maybe you should look beyond your fear before judging someone. And the teacher clapped her hands and asked for silence, and the practice ended, but the damage was done, and Eli knew more students disliked him now than before. As the day ended, Eli walked alone through the corridor of glowing glass and turned a corner where strange statues of old leaders stood in silent watch, and suddenly a message appeared on his wrist, communicator with strange symbols that changed into English, and it said, leave now, before it is too late. And the screen flickered and turned off and would not turn back on, no matter how many times he tapped. Eth looked around, but saw no one, and his heart raced again, and he felt like he was being followed, so he walked faster and reached the dorms where each student had their own room. And as he opened the door, he saw a shadow move behind him, but when he turned, it was gone, and the hallway was empty and cold, and he stepped inside and locked the door. That night, he could not sleep, and he kept looking at the stars outside his window, and wondered if this school was a test or a trap, and why the crystal glowed in his hand only when Nyxia helped, and what secret was hiding behind these alien walls, and what it meant when the message said too late, and if someone was watching him right now while he slept him before, and some of them were scared and some were just curious. And she said she thought he looked nice and normal and not dangerous, and he thanked her and offered her an apple slice, which she took carefully and tasted slowly. And then her face lit up in surprise, and she said, this is amazing. And he laughed for the first time that day, but just when he started to feel better, a small round device rolled under his table, and before he could move it, exploded with a puff of green smoke that smelled like rotten fruit, and he jumped up coughing, and some girls nearby laughed, while others looked shocked, and the teacher rushed over and demanded to know who did it, but no one spoke, and the device disappeared into dust. Eli's face turned red again, and he wanted to go back home. But then he remembered his father's words in the morning that said, be brave and show them what humans can do, and he wiped his face and sat back down, and Nyxia gave him a small smile and said, welcome to the academy. And Eli nodded silently, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The next day began with silence and soft blue lights moving across the academy walls, as if they were alive and breathing. And Eli walked through the long corridor with slower steps and his mind full of questions and fears, and the memory of the warning message still flashing inside. His head and the empty hallway made every sound louder and every shadow longer neary. Waiting near the crystal garden where the glowing trees hummed gently and the air smelled like sweet wind and space dust. And she waved at him with a calm smile and told him to follow her quickly, because she wanted to show him something before class started, and he nodded without a word and walked behind her as she moved fast through secret doors and curved paths that opened only when her wristband touched the walls. They stopped at a small hidden room behind the library, and the walls were made of living stone that pulsed like a heartbeat. And in the center of the room was a floating crystal table with many small stones arranged in a pattern, and Nyxia said, "This is the original practice chamber for energy users and not even most teachers. No, it still exists," and she asked him to sit and place his hands on the cold surface. I hesitated for a moment, but then he placed his palms on the smooth, glowing table, and Nyxia placed a small orange crystal in front of him and said, "This is not like the ones in class, because this one comes from the flame star, and it reacts to truth and emotion, not to strength and force." And she told him to clear his thoughts and just let the stone feel his presence heal. Closed his eyes and took a deep breath and tried not to think of the strange looks or the green smoke or the message on his screen, and tried to feel only the quiet room and the warmth of Nyxia standing beside him, and the hope that maybe she really wanted to help. And slowly the stone began to glow with a soft golden light that shimmered like morning sun on water. Nyxia gasped and said, "This crystal has never responded this way before," and she leaned in and said, "Your energy is not like ours, but it is not wrong either, and it feels old and deep, like something from the past." And Eli opened his eyes and looked at the glowing stone and asked what that meant, and Nyxia said, "There are old stories about humans who once traveled beyond their own stars before losing the path." And she said, "Maybe you are not just here to learn, but also to remember." Before Eli could ask more, the door behind them slid open with a sharp sound, and a voice said, "You are not allowed here." And the girl with flaming hair stood there, with her arms crossed and her eyes burning, and she said, "Of course, the human is sneaking around in old places with secret crystals and stay. And of course you are helping him, Nyxia, because you always want to fix broken things." Nyxia stepped forward and said, "We are not breaking rules, and he is trying to learn, and that is more than what you do with your anger and fear." And the other girl laughed and said, "Maybe he is trying to steal our power, or maybe he is part of something bigger and darker." And Eli stood up and said nothing, but his heart was loud inside his chest, and he felt the crystal still warm in his hand. The teacher arrived a moment later and told them all to return to class, and as they walked back, Nyxia whispered that the crystal would now be linked to him and that he should keep it hidden for now, because not everyone wanted him to unlock what was sleeping inside him. And Eli nodded and hid the small stone in a fold of his uniform during class. He could feel the crystal pulse gently like the night fell slowly over the academy, and the stars above shimmered like silver lanterns in the sky, and Eli sat near the window of his room holding the orange crystal that still pulsed with soft light, and his thoughts moved in circles like waves crashing again and again as the warning messages echoed in his memory, and the questions grew louder in his head, and sleep refused to come. He remembered Nyxia's words about the stories of humans who once traveled far and touched stars no one else could reach, and he thought maybe the truth was hidden somewhere in this place, and maybe the academy had answers locked behind doors that only a few dared to open, and he knew he had to look deeper, no matter what danger waited on the other side. When the halls turned quiet and the lights dimmed for sleep mode, he slipped out of his room and walked carefully through the curved corridors, and his footsteps, soft like whispers, and his hand holding the crystal tight. Inside his pocket, and the air around him felt colder than usual, and the silence thick like fog. He reached the library door, which was locked, but Nyxia had shown him a side panel earlier, and he touched the small glowing stone from his wristband to it. And the door opened with a soft click, and he stepped inside, and the smell of old pages and electric dust filled the air, and the shelves reached the ceiling and floated gently like giant leaves on water. He walked past shelves filled with memory orbs and scrolls, made of light and digital tomes that changed shape when touched. And he found a section marked with strange symbols that the crystal in his pocket reacted to, and he followed the soft, pulsing glow until he stood in front of a black panel that asked for voice access. He whispered his name, and the panel remained silent, and then he placed the crystal on the scanner, and the wall melted into a doorway, and beyond it was a hidden room lit by golden fireflies floating in the air, and the walls were covered with carvings that looked like human hands and stars drawn with flames. At the center stood a pedestal, and on it lay a scroll made of crystal strands, and when he touched it, the words formed in the air around him, and they told of a time when humans were not silent watchers, but bold travelers who helped build peace among galaxies and wielded energy that came not from machines but from the heart and mind together. The scroll spoke of a last flame hidden in the blood of a forgotten line, and a warning that when fear returned, the fire would rise again through one who walks in two worlds. And Eli stepped back as the crystal in his pocket grew warmer, and the room dimmed as if the words themselves had taken a breath and gone quiet. Before he could read more, a sharp sound echoed behind him, and he turned to see a shadow move near the door, and a figure stepped into the light with long robes and glowing blue eyes, and the figure said, "You should not be here, and this story is not for you." And Ela asked, "Who are you, and why hide the truth about humans?" The figure did not answer, but moved closer and tried to take the scroll, and Eli grabbed it first and ran past him as alarms started to ring through the halls, and the walls turned red, and the lights flashed like fire, and he ran without thinking, turning left, then right downstairs, and through a hall of statues until he reached the outer path near the gardens. There Nyxia was waiting with wide eyes, and she asked what happened, and Eli showed her the scroll and told her about the story and the figure with glowing eyes and the strange message. And Nyxia took his hand and said, "We have to hide this now, because if the council finds out, they might remove you from the academy, or worse." They ran together through the darkness and found an old maintenance hatch near the energy dome and climbed inside and sat in the shadows as guards passed above them, and the scroll wrapped in Eli's coat, and Nyxia holding a small light that flickered softly in her palm. Eli asked her if she believed the scroll, and she said, "I believe in you, and if the crystal chose you, then the story must be real, and that means you are not just a student here, but something more, and maybe you came here for a reason bigger than any of us thought." They sat there in silence, listening to the distant alarms and the beating of their hearts, and the soft whisper of truth that had been buried for too long and now had started to rise again. Like fire returning to the starset was alive and calling, and the floating symbols in front of him started to make more sense, and for the first time he raised his hand and answered a question about star maps, and the teacher gave a small nod of approval, and some girls turned their heads and stared, but said nothing. Later that day, as he walked back to his room, a small round droid followed him slowly and beeped once before projecting a message in the air that read, "Stop looking into what is hidden and leave before you wake the fire." And the message vanished before he could record it, and the droid rolled away and disappeared into a drain pipe under the floor. Eli sat in his room, holding the orange crystal, and stared at the stars outside, and wondered if the fire was already awake, and if he was the one holding the match, and he wondered if trust was the right choice, or the most dangerous one. And he thought of Nyxia and the glowing stone and the warmth in his hand that felt more real than fear and more true than anything he had known before. The next morning arrived with soft mist floating through the academy halls and a calm stillness that felt strange after the night, filled with alarms and shadows, and Eli stood at the edge of the practice dome with the scroll hidden safely in his bag and his heart filled with questions that had no answers and fears that grew louder with every step he took. The announcement came from the head of the academy, who appeared above the crowd in a floating sphere made of crystal and light, and she spoke in a clear voice that echoed across the field and said the annual Unity tournament would begin today, and all students must join and choose a partner from a different species to prove trust, teamwork, and balance of energy. Gasps and whispers spread across the students, and some smiled while others looked worried, and Eli felt a tight knot form in his chest because he knew no one would pick him, and he was not sure if he would even be allowed to join. But then Nyxia stepped forward without fear and called his name with strength and kindness in her voice, and the entire crowd turned to Steriel, looked at her in silence for a moment, and then walked slowly to her side, and the head of the academy raised her hand and nodded and said, "Very well, your trial begins now," and the floor of the dome changed into a shifting platform of glass, stone, and water, and the first task appeared in the air, written in glowing symbols that said "Cross the field without touching the ground and reach the orb of truth before it fades." Platforms began to rise and fall and spin like pieces of a giant puzzle, and Nyxia looked at Eli and said, "Do not think, just move, and trust me." And she jumped onto the first platform and held out her hand, and Eli followed her and jumped without looking down and grabbed her hand just as the floor below vanished. They moved together from one platform to another, and sometimes Nyxia led, and sometimes Eli did, and each time they looked at each other, their movements became faster, and their steps more steady, and their bonds stronger, and finally they reached the center and touched the orb just before it faded, and the crowd cheered from above, and the next task appeared at once. This time they had to enter a mirrored maze filled with illusions, fears, and doubts, and they stepped inside holding hands, and the reflections began to whisper lies, and shadows danced around them, and one mirror showed Eli alone in a burning earth, calling for help, while another showed Nyxia trapped in chains, held by her own kind, and the voices said, "You will never be enough. You will always be a stranger." Eli closed his eyes and said, "These are not real." And Nyxia held his hand tighter and said, "We decide what is real," and together they pushed forward until the maze broke into dust and light, and they stood in a quiet room with a single crystal flower in the middle. And they touched it together, and it bloomed with colors never seen before, and the trial ended with silence. And after the tasks were complete, the head of the academy said only 2 teams remain for the final test. And one of them is Eli and Nyxia, and the final challenge is the trial of choice, where partners must face a moment where only one can succeed, and the other must fall back, and it is a test of loyalty, truth, and heart. They stood in a high tower, with wind roaring around them, and a single bridge reaching to the goal, with space below, and the voice said only one may cross and touch the flame. To complete the trial, the other must wait behind, and Eli looked at Nyxia, and Nyxia looked at him, and no words were needed because both knew what the other felt. Eli said, "I will step back and let you win," and Nyxia said, "No, your journey is greater, and mine will follow another path." And then, without warning, a shadow moved behind them, and Kalina appeared with fire in her eyes and anger in her steps, and she said, "Neither of you will win today, because the trial is a lie, and the academy does not want him here." She raised her hand, and a blast of red light shot toward Eli, and Nyxia jumped in front of him, and the light hit her shoulder, and she fell to the ground with a cry, and Eli caught her in his arms, and something inside him broke and rose. At the same time, like a wave that could not be stopped, he stood with fire in his eyes, and his hand raised, and the orange crystal glowed brighter than ever before, and the wind around him stopped, and the bridge steadied, and Kalina stepped back. With wide eyes and the voice of the academy echoed, saying, "Enough, the trial is over, and the heart has spoken." Nyxia held Nyra close as the light around them faded, and the others watched in silence, and the truth was clear to all, that this boy was not just human, but something more, something forgotten now remembered, something quiet now awakened. Air inside the academy grew heavy as whispers turned into storms, and silence turned into questions, and Eli sat beside Nyra in the healing chamber, where soft lights floated above her and gentle waves of energy moved through her body as machines and crystals worked together to ease the pain from the blast she had taken to save him from Kalina's sudden attack during the final trial. His hand never left hers, and the orange crystal sat quietly near her heart, glowing with a steady light that pulsed in rhythm with her breath, and the doctors spoke in low tones, and the teachers stood behind glass walls, watching without speaking, and the head of the academy stood still with unreadable eyes fixed on the human boy who had done what no one expected outside. The chamber news of what had happened spread across the academy like wildfire, and students gathered in corners to talk about the human who glowed like a star, and the girl who defended him, and the other who attacked without warning, and trust began to crumble, while fear began to rise like smoke inside closed rooms. Kalina was taken away by council guards, and her voice echoed down the halls as she screamed that this was only the beginning, and that the academy would fall. And no one listened, but everyone heard her words, and no one forgot them, and the teachers began long meetings behind sealed doors, and secret messages were sent to planets that had not spoken to Earth in many years. Later that day, Eli was called to the High Council chamber, where the walls shimmered with gold and light, and the 12 members of the council sat like statues with faces made of shadow and flame and wind, and they spoke not with mouths, but with thoughts that pressed heavy on his mind. And they asked him where he got the orange crystal and what else he had hidden from them. He told them the truth about the scroll in the hidden room, and the message it revealed, and the energy he felt inside him since the first time he touched the crystal, and he spoke of Nyra's help, and Kalina's jealousy, and the voice that warned him to leave, and the droid that gave him threats, and the figure in the hidden library with blue eyes and long robes. The council said these stories are dangerous, and the knowledge you have found was not meant for students, and one of them said, perhaps not even meant for humans. And they asked him to hand over the crystal and return to Earth for further study and safety. But Eli said no, and that he would not leave Nyra behind, and that he had not come to destroy, but to learn and protect, and maybe even to remind the galaxy who humans really were. His words echoed longer than expected, and one council member leaned forward and said, "We shall decide soon, and until then you are confined to your room, and may not leave without a guard, and your access to the academy's systems is blocked, and the trial results are frozen, and no announcement of winners will be made." Eli nodded with a clenched jaw and walked back to his room under guard, and the crystal hidden again in his shirt, and his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts and fears, and a soft fire burning deeper than ever before. And he looked out the window and saw the stars, but they felt farther than usual, like walls had been built around them. That night the alarm rang again, and red lights flashed through the academy, and loud voices called all students to safety zones, and the guards ran through the halls with weapons drawn and shields up, and Eli rushed to the main hall only to see a large crack open in the sky dome, and dark shapes falling through. Like shadows with wings and claws, the Voiders had returned, and this time, not in silence or fear, but with full rage and hunger, and they screamed with voices like ice breaking and fire cracking, and their eyes glowed with black smoke, and their bodies twisted like broken machines, and they tore through the barriers as if they were made of paper, and the students screamed, and the teachers fought with beams of light and shields of K's and words of power. Lai looked around for Nyra and found her standing weak, but ready in the hall, and she had wrapped her shoulder and held a staff that glowed green. And when she saw him, her eyes widened, and she said, "This is the moment, and now we see." if the fire inside you is real or just a story, and Eli nodded without a word and stepped forward. He raised his hand, and the orange crystal flew into his palm and burned with light. So bright the shadows paused for a second, and all eyes turned to him, and Nyxia stood by his side, and together they moved toward the storm. Without fear, because fear had already tried to break them and failed. The sky above the academy burned with cracks of dark lightning as the voiders flew down like shadows given wings, and fear moved through every hallway. Like cold wind, and students hid behind broken walls and shattered shields, and teachers stood side by side with weapons made of light, but even their strength began to fade as the enemy kept coming without rest, without reason, without war. Seal stood in the center of the chaos with Nyxia by his side, and the orange crystal now blazing in his hand like a small sun that refused to go out, and his heart beat like a drum, louder than any scream and stronger than any fear. And Nyxia whispered to him that this is your moment, and the fire that chose you is waiting, and you must let it rise. He nodded without speaking and stepped forward through the ruins of the garden where the crystal trees had been cut down by black fire, and their glowing leaves now scattered across the ground like fallen stars, and the voiders turned their heads as one hand stared at the boy with fire in his eyes, and they screamed a sound that broke glass and bent steel. One of them flew toward Eli with claws sharp as blades and wings wide as ships, and Nyxia raised her staff, but Eli raised his hand, and the crystal lit up with a blast of pure orange light, and the creature stopped mid-air, frozen by something older and deeper than any weapon, and it screamed again, but this time in fear, and then vanished into dust. The others hesitated, and the teachers looked at Eli with wide eyes, and the head of the academy appeared above the battlefield with a voice like thunder, and said, "The flame has returned, and the legend is true, and the time has come to stand, not as planets or species, but as one." And she called out to all students to rise and join the boy who carries the flame. Eli walked to the top of the broken stairs near the heart of the academy, where the old seal of the founders glowed under the dust, and he placed the crystal in the center of the seal, and closed his eyes, and reached into the deepest part of himself, not with thought, but with feeling, not with force, but with hope, and the light exploded around him in waves of warmth and sound. The seal cracked and opened, and from beneath it rose a sphere of ancient energy, and it floated above Eli's head, spinning faster and faster until it burst into a ring of fire that wrapped around the academy like a shield and pushed the voiders back with a force they could not fight. And the wind screamed and the walls shook, but the fire-held students came out of hiding and stood beside their teachers, and the alien girls, who once feared the human boy, now looked at him with awe and stepped forward with weapons ready and voices steady. And Nyxia stood taller than ever, her wounds forgotten, and her eyes locked on Eli, as if seeing him for the first time again together. They formed a line between the academy and the darkness, and when the voiders came again, they did not find fear. They found unity and strength and fire, and after one final scream, they vanished like smoke and wind, and the sky turned calm, and the stars came back, and the academy stood strong, not because of walls or weapons, but because of hearts that refused to break. When the sun rose above the purple horizon, the students gathered in the main hall, and the head of the academy stepped forward and said, "The Unity Tournament has ended, but its true winner is not one name or one team. It is the spirit of what we have seen and felt and survived." And she turned to Eli and said, "The flame of old was never lost, it only waited for the right heart to return." She placed a new badge on his chest, shaped like a crystal flame, and the students cheered, and some clapped and some cried, and Nyxia stood beside him with her hand in his, and said, "This is only the beginning, and you are no longer a visitor. You are one of us." Silly looked around at the faces that once feared him, and now smiled at him, and he felt something shift inside, something new and strong, like roots taking hold in rich soil. And he knew that this place, this school, these people were now his to protect, not just with power, but with truth and kindness, and Courage that night, he stood once more at the window of his room and looked up at the stars, not as a boy from a distant planet, but as a spark of something greater. And the crystal sat quietly near. His heart no longer blazing, but warm like a promise waiting to be kept, and Nyra's voice echoed softly in his memory, saying, "You are more than what you were told, and you are exactly what we need." He smiled, not because the story had ended, but because it had finally begun.